Okay, so I pulled this table almost virtually intact out of the textbook, so hopefully you're not taking notes off these PowerPoints anyway, but you can look this up in the textbook, and actually he's got examples in a third column that I just went ahead and cut off. I'm not really big on memorizing all 8 of Erikson's stages either. I really like to emphasize infancy, which I already just got done talking about with the different parenting styles and attachment types. If you have a securely attached baby, a securely attached toddler, that implies that they've developed basic trust for the environment, which means that their first stage of psychosocial development was resolved on the positive side. The key thing in Erikson's stages that make them really interesting are, 1, he thinks that at each stage of development, you are confronted with different psychosocial conflicts. So in infancy, your conflict is between developing trust or mistrust for the environment. And it's a matter of the feedback that you get from the environment that determines which side you're going to resolve the conflict on. So if your environment has been very reliable and trustworthy, then you'll resolve this conflict on the positive side. And what that means is that you'll have more psychological energy to take with you into the toddlerhood stage to deal with the autonomy versus shame and doubt stage. If you resolve the conflict on the negative side, you're going to have a harder time resolving the autonomy versus shame and doubt conflict on the positive side because you're already at a deficit coming into it. So it's in our best interest at each stage to help children to resolve the conflicts on the positive side. So infancy, we got trust versus mistrust. We got some stuff going on through toddlerhood and preschool. I wanted to take us next to young adulthood. Adolescence, and the identity versus role confusion issue. Because a lot of you guys are still adolescents or were recently adolescents, this one will really make sense to you. That during our teen years, we are struggling with figuring out who we are, what we like, what we value, what's important to us. If we resolve it on the positive side, we'll come out of this conflict with a solid identity. We'll know who we are. If we resolve it on the negative side, we will be confused. We'll struggle for years trying to figure out, where do I fit in? What's important to me? What kind of people should I surround myself with? That's going to have impacts on your next stage, which is young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. If you resolved your identity conflict on the negative side and you're in role confusion, and you move into young adulthood and try and find a partner to get intimate with, and you don't know who you are yet, Erikson thinks that's going to set you up for disaster in your intimate relationship. That you need to have a good, strong identity before you can get intimately connected to another person. Now, Erikson was doing his theorizing in the 1940s and 50s. So he was kind of traditional in the way he talked about things. For him, intimacy is resolved by getting married. The reason why he thought that was such an important stage of young adulthood is that it sets you up for the next stage, which is generativity, which he said most of us resolve by having children. The way that you leave a mark on the future, which is what he meant by generativity, the way that most of us leave a mark on the future is by leaving some of our genes behind in the form of children, right? And then we raise them to be little, citizens that hopefully have values that are similar to ours and so on. So he said for most of us, if we resolve identity on the positive side, then we have a good, strong identity where we can then find a good, strong, intimate relationship to pair up and then face the generativity conflict and solve that on the positive side by having, reproducing. Other things that you can do to achieve generativity are things like mentor people at work, coach a sports team, write a book, leave a piece of art behind, something like that. Late adulthood is when we kind of do a life evaluation, look back and see how we lived our lives, and can we basically say we did the best we could and resolve this conflict on the side of integrity, or do we look back and say, oh, if only I could go back, if only I could do things differently, and we end our lives in despair. So the second thing that I wanted to point out about Erikson, because I kind of went through the list accidentally instead of saying my second thing. So point 2, back to what I was going to say. You'll notice that Piaget ended at puberty, right? Erikson's just getting started. He's got 3 more stages after puberty. So Erikson is different from a lot of stage theorists, not just Piaget, but also Freud, because he believed that we continue to develop even in adulthood, and that we still are facing conflicts and challenges our entire lifetime. Now, the thing about Erikson's stages, they make really good intuitive sense. You look at them and you go, yeah, that explains a lot of things about people's behaviors and attitudes and stuff like that. But you know what? Not much research supports the idea that you're bound up in desire for generativity in middle adulthood or something like that. But it makes just good intuitive sense. So I like to cover Erikson's model. I like that he covers the entire lifespan with his model, and I like the idea that all through your life you have these positive and negative outcomes, and that they can set you up for psychological health or difficulty. The last thing I wanted to say about social development, actually I don't think this is the last thing. Last thing I want to say about social development that has to do with young people is the generation gap. The idea that this was first initiated by the hippies, who are baby boomers born between 1945 and 1964, who, when they were young adults, really felt like they were just polar opposites of their parents and what they called the establishment, the man, right? That old people just don't get the new young adults. Of course, I would like to point out every era of adolescent feels like that. I know my friends and I felt like that old people are just so out of touch, man. They are so square. They don't know what's going on. My dad reports that when he was a kid, in the dark ages, when my dad was young, he said same thing, that old people were old and they just don't get it. So I don't think it was something novel about baby boomers. I think the big difference was that this was that it happened with baby boomers at about the time that psychology was really starting to explore issues like social development. And so it was like this perfect confluence where baby boomers declared that the older generation was just completely different from the baby boomers, and that made researchers say, is there a generation gap? Is there a significant difference in basic values between parents and their young adult children, their adolescent children? Now, this chart that's on the screen right now is looking at the percent of positive warm interactions with parents that kids have when they're 2 to 4, and you see like 80% of interactions with parents are positive and warm when you're 2 to 4 years old. By the time you're 9 to 11, just over 20% of interactions that you have with your parents are positive and warm. As we age, we start to pull back from our parents, right? Our parents start to realize that they can't be giving you hugs and kisses and telling you that the swirl of color on your paper is awesome, tell me about it. Things like that anymore. That you start to get to a certain age and we start to actually have expectations, right? And we start wanting you to put effort in and all sorts of things that make things less positive and warm and more like you're at boot camp, right? So is there really a generation gap? Well, they took teenagers and put them in one room and parents and put them in another room so that they wouldn't influence each other. And then they asked them their opinions on big basic value issues like religiosity. How spiritual or how devoted to a religion do you feel? And parents and teens tended to match on their answers to that question. Career choices, they tended to match. When separated out, teens reported wanting the same basic things for themselves, career-wise, as their parents wanted for them, career-wise. Moral decisions, when you gave moral questions like Kohlberg would pose, parents and teens tended to solve those problems the same way. So it kind of implies that there really isn't a generation gap in the sense of, well, we just don't get each other and we're just so different. But instead that there might be stylistic issues that parents oftentimes react to, like hair color or tattoos or sagging pants, or in my family, for whatever reason, every male goes through a really long hair phase. My son's in the midst of trying to grow his hair out. I keep coercing him into letting me give him a little bit of a trim, so it's not quite as bad as some of the men in my family have gone through, but it's, he's going to one day look back at his 18-year-old picture and go, oh, geez, what was I thinking? But, right now he thinks it's the big rebellion thing. These stylistic things we kind of tease each other or goad each other or poke at each other about these things, but the truth is those are just stylistic things that the person's ultimately going to grow up and change anyway. The big basic values were probably laid down during this time of life when kids have a lot of positive, warm interactions with their parents, and parents are subtly conveying their values, and kids are picking it up. So teenagers may disagree with their parents on how to wear their clothing or how to spend their time. But ultimately, when they get older and they have kids of their own, you'll start to see that they actually share a lot of big basic values with their parents. So I always like to say, parents can probably relax a little bit. Emerging adult, of course, I did mention I tend to lean towards permissiveness, didn't I? So my policies always relax a little bit. Emerging adulthood is a new name for an old time period. When I was a student back in the 80s learning about developmental psychology, they called it young adulthood, and they called that period 18 to 40 years of age. And then as baby boomers were aging, I'm Gen X, in case you're doing any math and why I keep mentioning baby boomers. As baby boomers were aging, it was interesting how the end point for young adulthood kept growing. So it went from 40 when I was in my undergraduate training. By my master's degree, we were at 45. By my PhD, the end of young adulthood was 50. And then everybody started to go, okay, you guys, seriously, this is getting a little out of hand. Young adulthood is all the way up to 50. Come on. So some very brilliant mind, and I wish I could tell you who it was, I can't remember, came up with the idea of a new age bracket called emerging adulthood. And this is the period between 18 and 25. So it's the period of time when you're sort of in that limbo between adolescence, when you're still dependent on your parents, you're probably living at home, your parents are maybe paying your tuition or helping support you in tuition, or maybe you're paying some of your own bills, but your parents are paying others, not charging you rent, that kind of stuff, right? And then true adulthood, where you are seriously on your own and you're taking care of yourself. So emerging adulthood was a term that was coined to describe that sort of period of limbo that most of us go through. So you might be living with your parents while you're attending college or you're going to work. It kind of makes sense to change the name or to give a special time period because on average Americans are marrying somewhere around their mid-20s. It's around 26 for if you average male and female age. So it kind of makes sense that you haven't fully achieved adult status until you're ready to go to that next stage of adulthood, which is complete, responsibility, maybe generativity, those kinds of things. One of the things that's been going on over the past 150 years, really, they started collecting this data in the Netherlands back in like 1840, if you can believe it. They were looking at the age of first menstrual period, and we call that menarche. For American data, we have it going back as far as 1890. So in the top panel, you see menarche in 1890 was at about 14 3/4 years of age. And then the average woman got married in 1890 at about 22. So the average woman was reproductively capable for about 7.2 years before getting married, and in 1890 birth control was not available and stuff. So once you got married, you were pretty much going to start reproducing and like that. Today, well, this chart is 1995. It's actually dropped another couple of months in the interval since 1995. Menarche has actually dropped to today. It's about 12 1/4 on average in the U.S. So we've had a drop of 2.5 years in about a 100-year period. Meanwhile, the age of marriage has climbed. So now we're looking at, like I mentioned before, about 26 today. This is 1995 data, so we're looking at 25 years of age for women. So what we're experiencing right now is an expansion of that interval between reproductive capability and then the onset of full adult behavior, getting married and planning on having kids and stuff like that. So it makes sense that we have a new name for that period of time where, you are ready, you're an adult, you have legal status in the U.S. in a lot of ways. You can't legally drink or legally buy or use marijuana, but you can join the military, you can enter into leases, you can do a lot of other, you're responsible for your own crimes by the time you're 18, stuff like that. So you've got legal status, you're not fully independent yet, you're not ready to take those things on. A lot of people during the 18 to 25 year period are in college or the military where they've got that period of time where they're not completely out on a limb by themselves yet. So emerging adulthood explains that period of time. Let's go ahead, since I was talking about marriage as the end point of emerging adulthood, let's go ahead and pick up with love and marriage in the next segment and finish up with that topic.